So, a new report was leaked to foreignpolicy.com dated August the 3rd, 2017, 9 days before the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville occurred, which would see the murder of Heather Heyer. And this report from the FBI has raised a lot of alarms, and rightfully so, because of who it targets and what it does. For all intents and purposes, and I'm sure many people watching this video already have already seen previous videos by some other YouTubers, and you know, have seen people talk about it on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and wherever else. The report is titled Black Identity Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers. And for all intents and purposes, what this report represents, and as I will lay out throughout the course of this video, the feds who, you know, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to call the boys from this moment on, they have basically criminalized blackness. That's exactly what they've done. There's no other way to describe it. For them to create a fictional label of a fictional movement that's not actually even occurring, okay, and place the target on people who identify with blackness, okay, as potential extremists, i.e. potential domestic terrorists, the ability to commit widespread constitutional violations has never been greater for people who are fighting against white supremacy and for people who are calling out state violence on a consistent basis. This is placing a target on everybody's back. I'm going to read parts of the article on foreignpolicy.com, then I'm going to move into the report itself, then I'm going to touch on a few other topics. This is going to be a long video. Matter of fact, this might end up being the longest video I've ever done. I might have to end up cutting a lot of it out. And to be perfectly honest with you, there's a lot that I have to not say, because when you have reports like this coming out, which is effectively COINTELPRO 2.0, which I will explain and explain what that really means later on in the video. When you have something like this hanging out there, this cloud of surveillance and potential violation of rights under the guise of counterintelligence and counterterrorism, you just have to be careful with what you say. But let me just read some of this article and then I'll continue. It says, as white supremacists prepared to descend on Charlottesville, Virginia in August, the FBI warned about a new movement that doesn't exist, that was violent, growing, and racially motivated. Only it wasn't white supremacist. It was, quote, Black Identity Extremists. Amid a rancorous debate over whether the Trump administration has downplayed the threat posed by white supremacist groups, the FBI Counterterrorism Division has declared that Black Identity Extremists, or BIEs, pose a growing threat of premeditated violence against law enforcement. Let me end it right there. Let me stop right there. The timing of this is very important. So this came out, well, this report was being circulated behind closed doors a little over a week, but basically a week and a half before Charlottesville actually went down. Now, we know when Trump got into office, one of the first things he did was take away funding from groups of people, or from the groups within the government that were monitoring white extremist groups and white supremacist groups. Okay, and so for this to be circulated a little over a week before Charlottesville happened, and you literally have right-wing domestic terrorists marching in streets of America, advocating for ideas that could lead to the mass murder of civilians, which you have to take that into account when you're talking about neo-Nazis and white supremacists and things like that. It's a fundamentally violent ideology. Historically, it's not hyperbole. Okay, so the timing, so for this to come out before that, And after the Trump administration deliberately goes out of its way to protect essentially white supremacists, okay, it's very telling, because what this signifies is that this signifies codified false equivalency that is making its way throughout our government. And even more so, what's even more important is the context of when this is being quote unquote leaked. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know that it was leaked. It might have just been given to foreignpolicy.com. And they might just be saying that it was leaked. Or maybe they actually think that it was leaked and it wasn't leaked. You know, they intentionally, whoever quote unquote leaked it from inside the FBI or from inside the boys organization, did it intentionally because of not necessarily Charlottesville now, but because of Vegas. You know, the act of domestic terrorism in Vegas, which it was. They're now trying to say that, you know, even though Stephen Paddock has no history of mental illness, they're now just claiming, well, you know, he had a mental illness that was undiagnosed. So they're running with that lone wolf narrative, anything to not call Stephen Paddock a domestic terrorist. And so for this to come out now after Vegas to say that no, what we really have to worry about are these fictional black identity extremists, which is the counterintelligence version of a fantasy novel. Like the person who wrote this report might as well be writing fantasy, like in the vein of J.R.R. Tolkien or George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones. This is like Game of Thrones counterintelligence. This is fantasy. Okay, this is complete fiction. So we have to be aware of the attempt by the establishment to take the spotlight off of white supremacists, because everyone's talking about white supremacists. Everyone is calling this administration white supremacism administration. So this has to be viewed in context of what else is going on in the country. We can't view it as somehow being independent. It continues, the article continues, the FBI assesses it is very likely, okay, meaning there's a high percentage probability that BIEs, or Black Identity Extremists, perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated retaliatory lethal violence against law enforcement, and will very likely, okay, again, they're saying that something that doesn't exist is very likely to happen, serve as justification for such violence. Now, if you want to continue reading the foreign policy article, you can definitely do that. I'm not going to focus so much on the article itself, because what the article does is pretty much go over certain things that's in the report itself. So I'd much rather read the report and break down the report, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to basically read the summary and pick out the most important parts of the report. And like I said, as I read it, understand that this is the boys basically criminalizing blackness. They're not saying black supremacists, which is also another term that's a misnomer that doesn't actually exist. There are no real black supremacist groups in the country. Okay, there are groups that white people have a problem with, and they say certain things that they don't like, but they don't actually necessarily advocate black supremacy. Or you can't have two separate systems of supremacy. So, but this report isn't even saying that. They're not, because they know that they can't label everybody in the black community, not even black activists, as black supremacists, because we can just easily deny that. So they created this term that's much broader and create a much bigger dragnet to include a much larger group of people. And after I read the report, I'm going to tell you specifically who they're trying to target. They're calling certain people BIEs, but like I said, when you criminalize blackness, which is what this does, you do it to get as many people as possible. So black supremacists, you're talking about too few people. You need a larger term to include a larger number of black people that you want to violate the rights of. So let me go into the report itself. So I suggest that everybody actually read the report, download the report yourself and really read it. You have to know what's being said in these reports that the government puts out. So read this report, read the DOJ reports out of Ferguson and Baltimore and Chicago. These reports are long. This one is actually short. This one is only 12 pages, but a lot of times these reports go 20, 30, 40, 50 pages and whatnot. Read these reports because you have to know exactly what your government is up to. Okay, but this is the executive summary. It says the FBI assesses it is very likely. So when they say very likely, let's go down. I'm gonna cut this short because I want people to understand what they mean when they say very likely. Okay, so that means something in particular. So when you go to Appendix A, okay, it says phrases such as, quote, the FBI judges and the FBI assesses, quote unquote, and terms such as, quote, likely and probably convey analytical judgments and assessments. And then there's a chart at the bottom that basically breaks down what this all means, what they mean when they say very likely. And so the Black Authority put up a video recently about this very topic, and the video has already been flagged, and YouTube is already playing games with it. I'm hoping my video doesn't suffer the same consequences, and I haven't checked today. I don't know if the video is actually still up, but he actually breaks this all down, and I actually wanted to include it in my video as well because they use these terms very likely and almost certainly all throughout this report. So when they say very likely, it's saying that in terms of probability, they're saying it's highly probable. Very likely means highly probable, or 80 to 95%. So they're saying that there's an 80 to 95% chance that whatever they're about to say is going to happen. And this is based on no data. This is based on it's highly subjective. It's not based on anything really tangible. It's just something that they're saying. And they're using this politically for a reason. I'm going to get later on into the video, I'm going to get onto the issue of COINTELPRO. Because these are COINTELPRO tactics. Okay, so just understand when you hear me say very likely, they're saying there's an 80 to 95% chance that this is going to happen. When they say likely, they're saying there's a 55 to 80% chance. Okay, I might have to go back to this appendix later on as I read the rest of the report to show you exactly the percentage chance they're putting on some of the things that they're saying based on absolutely nothing. So again, taking it back to the executive summary, it says the FBI assesses it is very likely, or there is a 80 to 95% chance that Black identity extremists or BIE's perceptions. So they're saying that basically Black people who talk about police brutality and crimes against humanity against the Black population in America, these are just our perceptions. These are just figments of our imagination. Okay, so they completely ignore evidence. They completely ignore data. They completely ignore the problematic nature of state violence. This is basically the state doubling down on crimes against humanity of Black people. Okay, and of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. So perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated, retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement, and will, again, very likely, so 80 to 95% chance, serve as justification for such violence. What are they basing that on? We don't know. I'm white and I say so, as people say. The FBI assess it is very likely, there's that term again, this increase began following the August 9, 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent grand jury November 2014 declination to indict the police officers involved. The FBI assesses it is, again, very likely, 80 to 95% chance, incidents of alleged police abuse, there's that word. So you have perceptions, alleged, against African Americans since then have continued to feed the resurgence in ideologically motivated violent criminal activity within the BIE movement. Whatever this movement is, nobody knows. It's whatever they say it is, really. The FBI assesses it is very likely, again, that term, some BIEs are influenced by, get this, by a mix of anti-authoritarian, Moorish sovereign citizen ideology and BIE ideology. When have you ever heard them say that being anti-authoritarian is extremist? They are connecting being anti-authoritarian. When you're anti-authoritarian, understand what that means. Authoritarian governments are dictatorships. Okay, when you're anti-authoritarian, you're anti-tyranny. So they are basically saying that these fictional BIEs, these Lord of the Rings BIEs, okay, they're basically creating a profile. So they're targeting people black people basically, who identify as people, activists who identify as black, who are anti-authoritarian. And they're saying there's a mix. So they're not saying that all quote unquote BIEs are anti-authoritarian and they're Moorish and they have this ideology. They're saying there's a mix. So you can simply be pro-black and anti-authoritarian, and you can be labeled a BIE purely just for being anti-tyranny or anti-authoritarian. There's nothing wrong, okay, about being anti-authoritarian. So for them to include that means that they view that as a threat. And then down at the bottom, okay, it says the FBI, or the boys, defines black identity extremists as individuals who seek wholly or in part through unlawful acts of force or violence in response to perceived racism and injustice in American society, and some do so in furtherance of establishing, quote, a separate black homeland, or, get this, autonomous black social institutions, communities, or governing organizations within the United States. Y'all, that's everybody. How many of us talk about creating black banks, black communities, buying land and creating black communities? When they say autonomous, they don't necessarily mean separate. Autonomous simply means independent. Okay, so independent black social institutions. Okay, BIEs, the FBI defines BIEs as individuals who seek, they say through unlawful, okay, but understand that there's wiggle room there. They can claim something as unlawful willy-nilly. They can very easily massage that to mean simply black people who are exercising their rights to create independent black political parties, independent black banks, any independent black social identity or social group, okay, or communities, or governing organizations within the United States. This desire for physical or psychological separation is typically based on either religious or political belief system, which is sometimes formed around or includes a belief in racial superiority or supremacy. Again, that's just not true. But what they're doing is they're tying the fictitious notion of black supremacy to black people who simply want to form independent black organizations and social institutions, okay, as a way of countering white supremacy. You really have to read between the lines. But they give themselves a little bit of political wiggle room. They say the mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, use of strong rhetoric, or generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute extremism and may be constitutionally protected. They have to add that in there to cover their own asses. But understand that could easily be violated. Now, further down on page 3, here's something else that's important that people need to be aware of. It says this assessment is the first FBI analytic intelligence product to assess influences between the sovereign citizen extremist movement and the black identity extremist movement. The FBI has previously reported on BIE retaliatory violence against law enforcement in 2 products, both of which had findings consistent with this assessment. The March 23, 2016 FBI intelligence bulletin titled Black Separatist Extremists Call for Retaliation in Response to Police-Involved Incidents Could Incite Acts of Violence Against Law Enforcement. So they're saying that this report is basically backing up previous reports. A report that came out March of 2016. Who is, as the Black Authority pointed out, who is in office March of 2016? That was under Obama. Okay, so this is really this particular report, this BIE BS report, the BS report is what it needs to be called. This is something that's coming out under Trump, okay, and could have been influenced by people like Bannon and Gorka and stuff like that. But understand that this report isn't really the first of its kind. It's the first to combine, it's the first to necessarily create this label of Black identity extremists, but it's not the first of its kind to target Black people that the U.S. government doesn't really like. It points to this previous document, which I'm sure you can still find online as well. I actually remember hearing about this. I don't think I wrote about it or anything like that, but I definitely heard about this previous report. And then it says there's another report from November the 14th of 2014, an FBI intelligence bulletin entitled Potential Criminal Reactions to Missouri Grand Jury Announcement. So since the Mike Brown incident, since the Ferguson incident, the FBI has been monitoring Black people, okay, and black activists, okay, who they know do not like the cover-ups of state-sanctioned violence and state-sanctioned murder of Black people. Ever since Ferguson, and ever since that blew up, and you had, a movement basically be created around that, they've been on alert. They've been on alert for years now. Okay, so you have every so often you have these reports being created, and it's now being taken to the next step where they're actually creating a classification of a certain type of Black people that they can target and that they can label as being an extremist. Okay, because of in their eyes perceived, which they say is basically fake notions of violence against Black people and injustice against Black people. It's not fake. It's real. Okay, when you have case after case after case of these, some people call them race soldiers, some people, I particularly use the acronym ASRV, Agents of State and Racial Violence, where you have these people who are going around killing Americans, and the state is circling its wagons around those people to get those people off. People have the right, and people are justified in being upset about that. And obviously that is now becoming a threat to the establishment. And what this is showing, and what this report represents, and other people have pointed this out, this actually shows that what we are doing is actually effective. What we are doing and speaking out is actually causing a lot of fear within the government, because it's causing waves. It's not going away. This isn't a flash in the pan like, Occupy Wall Street. That's something that just came out and evaporated in a few months. This has legs, it's consistent, and it's not going anywhere. And the reason it's not going anywhere is because the murder of Black people continues to occur and continues to be covered up. They know this, they know it's not going anywhere, and they're like, okay, we need to create a fictitious label to apply to these people as a way to do some things that I'm actually lay out in a second. Now it says on page 4, the FBI judges, it is very likely BIE perceptions of police brutality, again, perceptions, very likely, so 80 to 95% chance that, again, this label, basically, I don't even want to say BIE, okay, because that's their terminology. I'm just going to say Black people. Okay, because that's who they, or Black activists. That's who they're talking about. Okay, don't get it twisted. So the FBI judges that there's an 80 to 95% chance that Black activist perceptions of police brutality against African Americans have become organizing drivers for black activists, or it says BIE, but black activist movement since 2014, resulting in a spike of black activists intentionally, or BIEs intentionally targeting law enforcement with violence. So here's what they're doing, and I'm about to jump down to the bottom here. They're cherry picking 6 incidents that have occurred since 2014. Okay, 6 incidents since 2014. Okay, and none of these people were connected at all to any movement. That's very important for people to understand, which is why they have to create this BS label. They have to create this Lord of the Rings label, okay, for a Lord of the Rings movement, a fantasy movement that's a figment of the statist imagination, okay, to tie black activists arbitrarily to these attacks on police. This is what they're doing. And they're lumping everything together under BIE, Black Identity Extremists. It's very insidious. Okay, and it starts. I'm going to briefly touch on the 6 incidents that they've cherry-picked. Mind you, while I'm saying this, take into account that it's already come out that most people who attack law enforcement, another way of wording it is law enforcement is more likely to be attacked by white males. Something like 51% of all of the attacks on law enforcement is done by white males. Most of the time is right-wingers, right-wing extremists. Okay, they make up the vast majority of people who attack cops. This report mentions none of that. This report completely glosses over that all the way. They do not mention that at all. Okay? Even you most recently look at Vegas. The Vegas shooter, who I don't believe was acting alone. I think that there were multiple shooters. Okay? That's being covered up because they want to push the lone wolf narrative, because they don't want to talk about domestic terrorism from right-wing white people who make up a large portion of the Republican base. Okay, they specifically want to target, they want to deflect and target black activists, which is something that they've been wanting to do for years. And it's what they did in the 60s. Okay, so they're cherry picking these 6 attacks. Let me talk about these 6 attacks and keep what I just said in mind about the fact that most black people aren't even attacking cops like that. Especially not black activists. But listen, you have the July 7th, 2016 attack on 11 law enforcement officers by Micah Johnson. So they're bringing up Micah Johnson, okay? Killing 5 in downtown Dallas during a First Amendment protected protest before being ultimately killed by police. The 5 deceased police officers were white. The planned public event was protesting recent police officer involved shootings of African Americans in Louisiana and Minnesota. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this was this was a protest in Dallas involving the Alton Sterling shooting. Something else that was caught on camera where those ASRVs in that case, again, like always, were not prosecuted and were not brought to justice for murdering a man in cold blood. And it says, based on Johnson's journal writings and statements to police, he appeared to have been influenced by BIE ideology. Understand, that's never actually even been confirmed. This is something that they've just said that they haven't actually provided evidence for. So they're saying all sorts of things about what Micah Johnson said before they killed him that, we just have to take their word for it. And I don't even know whether to actually even believe he said those things or he made those claims, but that's what they're saying. And again, they're using that to create this idea of what a BIE ideology is. So they're bringing up Micah Johnson, then they're bringing up an incident that occurred in October of 2014. Zale H. Thompson attacked 4 white New York Police Department officers in Queens with a hatchet. I remember that story. According to open source reporting, Thompson was angered after a, quote, recent spate of deaths at the hands of police. In his own writings, Thompson advocated for armed struggle against the oppressors and mass revolt against the U.S. social, economic, and political systems. Again, no one's ever actually seen that. And this is what I mean when I say these are COINTELPRO tactics. I was going to get to this later, but now that I'm reading this, I want to bring it up, and I'm just going to repeat it later on in this video. One of the common tactics of COINTELPRO was to create false association articles. Okay, so what they did a lot of times in the 60s, when they wanted to create basically, for the lack of a better term, false flag, and I don't even want to use that term because it's been overused and it's used way too often by conspiracy theorists. Okay, but in COINTELPRO, no, they actually use like false flag tactics. They attributed writings and things and beliefs and communications to black activist groups and anti-war groups and just leftist groups in general that those groups actually didn't say and those groups actually didn't originate. It was actually something that was created by the FBI, specifically for the purpose of using psychological operations or psyops to create a specific narrative, a negative narrative of those movements and of those people. We have to keep that in mind when it comes to stuff like this. When they claim that certain people said certain things that we've never actually seen publicly. Okay, and we, since these people are dead, there's no way of actually verifying that this stuff was actually said by these individuals. So honestly, given how they're trying to create this fictitious notion of black identity extremists, we have to take into account that some of this stuff might not even be true. Some of the stuff that they're attributing to these individuals who actually did commit violent acts might be stuff that they actually created themselves. Keep that in mind. Some of this stuff might not actually even be real, but I'll continue. On October the 4th on October the 4th and October the 13th of 2016, an individual allegedly shot at two different police stations in Indianapolis. The subject left a handwritten note at the scene of one of the shootings in which he identified himself as a Moor and made anti-white statements. Okay, the subject posted pictures on social media of African-American men carrying assault rifles behind texts calling for social injustice and retribution. The subject was later involved in a shootout with police during his arrest on related charges, according to law enforcement reporting. Okay, according to them, that's what they say. Then they bring up Gavin Long. Y'all remember this? July 17th of 2016, Gavin Long ambushed and shot 6 law enforcement officers in Baton Rouge. This was in response to the Alton Sterling murder. Okay, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, before eventually being killed by police. Long had expressed black separatist rhetoric both on social media and in his manifesto, including rants against, quote, crackers, and reference to an African-American male killed. They don't even mention Alton Sterling's name. Like I'm reading this and they're like in reference to an African-American male. His name was Alton Sterling, killed by police in Baton Rouge on July 5th, 2016. Okay. Say his name. This is the extent to which they're going to not even acknowledge state violence. In his manifesto, Long expressed his frustrations with the police and criminal justice system in the United States and saw his actions as, quote, as a necessary evil. So this is showing that, they're not just going after political activists. They're going after black people who, y'all more science dudes, they're watching y'all too. Okay? Some of y'all RBG dudes, they watching y'all too. This report targets everybody. Now on page 6. So I'm going to read this. This is basically the end of this, silly report. Then I'm gonna move on to the next topic at hand. It says BIEs, or black activists, that's who they're talking about, have historically justified and perpetuated violence against law enforcement, which they have perceived as representative of the institutionalized oppression of African Americans but had not targeted law enforcement with premeditated violence for nearly 2 decades, leading up to the lethal incidents observed beginning in 2014. So, okay, so they say BIEs have historically justified and perpetuated violence against law enforcement. Again, they use this word perceived, which they perceived as representative of the institutionalized oppression of African Americans. Understand something. Okay, before I say that, I'm actually continue reading this. BIE violence peaked in the 1960s, leading up to the lethal incidents observed beginning in 2014. Or actually, BIE violence peaked in the 1960s and 1970s in response to changing socioeconomic attitudes and treatment of blacks during the civil rights movement. Okay, so they're applying this label that they just created to groups in the 1960s. BIE groups such as the Black Liberation Army, which was created in the early 1970s to, quote, take up arms for the liberation and self-determination of black people in the United States. Yada, yada, yada. Then they apply all sorts of charges onto them. So I'm going to basically skip to the end here. It says Outlook. The FBI assesses it is very likely that BIE's perceptions of unjust treatment of African Americans and the perceived unchallenged illegitimate actions of law enforcement will inspire premeditated attacks against law enforcement over the next year. They're saying that there is an 80 to 95% chance that this fake movement, the perceptions of people in this fake movement, again, this movement doesn't exist, which is how you know that it's a term that means something else. Okay, BIEs mean black people. This is an attempt to criminalize people who identify as black and people who advocate for black people. Okay, it says that perceived unjust treatment of African Americans and the perceived unchallenged illegitimate actions. It's not perceived. Unless you're trying to say the death of Alton Sterling, the death of Tamir Rice. This is just, these actions were just, see, what they try to say is, they try to say that no, these ASRVs, these race soldiers were justified in killing children, like Tamir Rice. They were justified in killing Michael Brown. They were justified. I said in a previous video, there is nothing that black people can do to not be murdered to some of these race soldiers, to some of these people within law enforcement, to the boys. There's everything. Anytime when somebody from our community is murdered, it's always justified by default. They're never in the wrong. They are always right. Okay, that is what the boys are saying in this report. They are saying the murder of black people is always justified. And anybody who says otherwise, that's just your perception. That's just don't believe your lying eyes. That's what this report is saying. This may also lead to an increase in BIE group memberships. What the hell is that? Okay, BIE group memberships, again, they're talking about specific black groups. Black progressive groups, black leftist groups, Black Lives Matter, all of black feminist groups. If you are in a black feminist group that talks about black women being murdered by police, assume everybody's being watched. Assume it all. The BIE group memberships, collaboration among BIE groups, or this would be funny if it weren't so serious. This is so fictitious, it's almost laughable. The person who wrote this needs to start writing fantasy and science fiction. It says this may also lead to an increase in BIE group memberships, collaboration among BIE groups, or the appearance of additional violent lone offenders motivated by BIE rhetoric. The FBI further assesses it is very likely 80 to 95% chance Additional controversial police shootings of African Americans and the associated legal proceedings will continue to serve as drivers for violence against law enforcement. Peep what they just said. They are projecting that, you know what, the murder of black people is going to continue, and because of the murder of black people will continue, it's going to serve as a driver for violence against law enforcement, which, again, they're specifically talking about 6 isolated incidents with individuals that weren't even connected to these quote-unquote BIEs. The FBI assesses it is likely police officers of minority groups are also targeted by BIEs because they are also representative of a perceived oppressive law enforcement system. Possible indicators. This is where people need to be careful. Possible indicators for BIEs posing a violent threat to law enforcement include advocating for violence against law enforcement, violent anti-white rhetoric, which is very broad, attempts to acquire illegal weapons or explosives, and affiliations with others in both the BSE and sovereign citizen extremist organizations. So I'm done reading this report. You guys should and can read it yourself. Okay? You have to know what's being done. You have to be aware of the agenda against you, because this report shows that there's a very real agenda against black people, outspoken black people. So much so they're so worried that they had to create an entire label arbitrarily to lump everybody under. Men, women, non-violent or not. Again, they're saying violent, but they can easily label what you're saying as being violent. They do it all the time. They've done it in the past. They can easily frame you. This is something else I want to say. Okay, be careful with individuals online. This is why you can't advocate for violence. Never do that. Never say anything violent. Never say that people should be attacked. And for content creators out here, ignore people online who say stuff like that, because you don't know who these people are. Entrapment is a very real thing. Okay, entrapment, basically, for what people don't know what that is, entrapment is when the boys come to you and say, hey, yeah, why we need to do this, that, and the third. We need to take down the government, yada yada yada. You know, if you want, I can show you. We can collaborate, and I can help you do it. Ignore all of that. If anybody comes to you with that type of rhetoric, because for all you know, that's the boys trying to entrap you. And what they'll do is they'll set you up, and they'll come in right before something happens, and they'll say, hey, you know, we just stopped a domestic terrorist threat from a BIE, from a black, and because with reports like this, and based on what they said at the end, we have to be aware that they might actually, because they're so desperate to create a false equivalency between fake BIEs and white supremacists, that and there's not really an equivalency there. So what they might start doing is they might start setting up entrapment scenarios where they can come in with the cape. They can come in as the heroes and stop a BIE terrorist attack. Because when they're really projecting like this, and they're saying, hey, you know, there are going to be police shootings in the future that's going to get these BIEs upset, and it's going to cause retaliation against law enforcement. And when they say that's very likely to happen, so there's an 80 to 95% chance that that's going to happen, they're basically guaranteeing that. And when you have the boys guaranteeing something like that, and they have a history of COINTELPRO entrapment, that is a major red flag. Okay, that means that they might set something up intentionally to say, that, hey, you know, it's not just the white supremacists doing domestic terrorism, it's the BIEs. We have to crack down on the BIEs. Be very mindful of what's going to happen in the future. And very skeptical of anything that you hear about some sort of BIE domestic terrorist plot. Now, think about something. And I need the family to follow me when I say this. Who does this report help? Think about that. A report like this only helps one group. There's only one group of people out there who they're probably doing cartwheels right now in their private message boards and their private chat rooms. They are doing cartwheels. They are happy. They're gleeful. They're like, yes, they finally, the boys finally did it. They're finally targeting the BIEs or Black Lives Matter. Okay, or black activists, black Twitter. This report is basically a gift package to the white supremacists. This report might as well have been written on Stormfront itself. Okay? This report is a gift package. They are creating talking points for the right wing. They are creating talking points for white supremacists. They are creating talking points for the alt-right. These are the only groups that benefit from this report. Now, I read the report to you guys, and I'm gonna break it down even further than that, because you can't just base everything of what's being said. They're not gonna really put their true agenda even in a report like this. Okay, and understand that there are reports, there are internal documents that we don't know about that are even more secret and more classified than this one. Which is why I'm skeptical that this was even leaked. I'm thinking that they intentionally put this out. And there are even more classified, deeper intelligence reports where they are more honest about why they're doing this and what they're really afraid of. And I'm going to tell you what they're really afraid of. Okay? Over the past few years, there has been a resurgence of black leftist radicalism. And when I say radicalism, I don't mean that negatively. Because not all forms of radicalism, not all ways of being radical are bad. They oftentimes use that word in a negative light. Oftentimes they do this mostly because they want to create a negative persona of the people that they don't like. What they don't tell people is that oftentimes what they are doing is also radical. See, you have different types of radicalism. So you can be radical in favor of progress, and radical in favor of freedom, and radical in favor of liberty and justice. You can be a radical progressive. I consider myself an independent. I'm no longer part of the Democratic Party. I consider myself an independent radical progressive. And what I mean by that is I want change as quickly as possible. I do not want incremental change. Incrementalism is weak. Incrementalism doesn't help people who are currently suffering. Incrementalism says we can bring change in a piecemeal fashion. So while people are still suffering, we're going to just twiddle our thumbs and sit on our hands and apply change as we see fit. So I am not an incrementalist. And because I'm not an incrementalist, I'm not a moderate. So I am radical in my progressive beliefs. I want an end to the drug war now. I don't want an end to the drug war over the course of 10 years. I want an end to it now, immediately. I think all nonviolent drug offenders need to immediately be released from prison. I don't think they need to serve out terms for an unjust reason for being in prison in the first place. They need to let my people go, goddamn. They need to immediately be released. That is a radical position, but it's a justified position. Okay, I believe in reparations. People who advocate for reparations, that is a radical position. It shouldn't be, but it is. In the American political context, that is a radical position. It is a radical progressive position to advocate for reparations. Okay, so there has been a resurgency, a rebirth, like a phoenix, of black leftist beliefs. You have a lot of black people who are not just black people. Like this is going on with white people too, white people on the left too. A lot of people are calling out the Democratic Party. A lot of people are realizing that the Democratic Party is not helping us. So we need to look to other parties. We need to look to the Democratic Socialists. We need to look to the Greens. Maybe we might even need to form our own political parties. And they are threatened by this. Okay? You have political black Twitter that has formed over the past few years. Hashtag take a knee. Hashtag Oscar so white. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. All of black political Twitter, okay, is setting off alarms because we have a lot of power. There's a lot of power in Twitter, and we now have power that is comparable to the mainstream media, which is their main propaganda arm. The corporate media, the corporate establishment media, is the propaganda arm of the state, which is why they cover up stories. It's why they regurgitate whatever law enforcement says and without challenging it. And unfortunately, you have some wishy-washy white leftist entities, new media entities on the left that kind of participate in this too. They kind of repeat and regurgitate police, whatever the police say, and they just take their word for it, despite the fact that the police have a history of lying when it comes to people they've murdered. But you know, it's easier to just take their word for it than believe that there's a systemic and systematic problem of cover-ups of state murder that's occurring on a daily basis in this country. It's easier for some of these white liberal organizations to just take their word for it, and that's exactly what the corporate media does. Okay, so more black people are looking, like I said, looking at these other political entities as alternatives. So they're worried about black Twitter today in anticipation that it'll be black people supporting third parties tomorrow. Okay, it'll be black people crowdfunding to form a black political economy tomorrow. So they're looking at what's happening now and they're projecting into the future. Oh crap. Like, they're going to start doing even more. Like, eventually it's not even just going to be black people on Twitter. Like, it's going to be black people being more proactive in combating white supremacy. Like I said, there's a growing discussion around reparations. Discussions about reparations are becoming mainstream. And understand something. They lose that argument. There aren't really any strong arguments against reparations. There really aren't. Because of what's happened to black people historically and currently, and how many of us have been murdered in the streets from lynchings, which was a form of state terrorism and racial terrorism. These discussions are now becoming mainstream, and that's a problem. And even so, I mean, you look at articles like by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's written about reparations, and you know, historically, reparations has not been a mainstream discussion, but it is now, and it's becoming even more so. So this resurgency has become so effective that even the United Nations, okay, has openly accused the United States of racial terrorism against black people in America. The United Nations, the UN, has called out the United States on racial terrorism. Let me read this to you. This is another report that came out last year. On page 16 of this report, which can be found online, number 68, okay, it says, despite the positive measures The working group remains extremely concerned about the human rights situation of African Americans, in particular, the legacy of colonial history, enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge, as there has been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for the people of African descent. Contemporary police killings and the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. Impunity for state violence has resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. The United Nations, specifically the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Okay, that was actually the UN group, the UN affiliated group in Geneva. They equated contemporary police killings with the racial terrorism of lynching. As I said on Twitter, and I had a little tweet that went a little viral, yay. I said terrorism, or I said lynchings never ended, okay, which they weren't. And the UN report basically backed that up. And this report equates police killings, modern day police killings, with lynchings, and effectively with racial terrorism. So when you have groups affiliated with the United Nations out of Geneva itself, as of last year, saying that the United States or saying that the United States should give reparations to people of African descent in America, and calls out America for racial terrorism, now you're starting to see why reports like this FBI report about fake BIEs, why these reports are coming out. So it's important that we go over the history very briefly, the history of COINTELPRO itself. COINTELPRO is short for Counterintelligence Program. And we have to understand that they've always had an anti-black agenda. Okay, the boys have historically had an anti-black agenda, especially under J. Edgar Hoover. Okay, and they've always looked to subvert and destroy black radical progressivism. I want to read you guys an excerpt from a man named Robert F. Williams. Some of you might have heard of him. He was the man who wrote the book Negroes with Guns. Okay, and he actually was forced into exile. I believe it was between 1961 or 64 and 1969. And when he was in exile, he gave a speech in China in 1966. Okay, and Robert F. Williams, he was very influential in the Black Panthers and some other groups that came after him. And he basically gave a speech about Black Power. I'm reading this because you have to understand the source of their fear of black people and their fear of black progressivism, and why they are now dusting off the COINTELPRO program, and they're basically advocating and making it known that they have a very concerted agenda against black people who advocate for black people. But let me read this. This is why all of this is one of the reasons why all of this is happening. And it's especially important that I mention this because in the FBI report, they mention BIEs of the 60s. Okay, so understand that this is the continued attempt by the boys to frame not only black people today, but to frame black people from the past. So Robert Williams says, what is the meaning of this cry, Black Power, in a land dominated by the unmerciful power of white intruders who murdered and all but exterminated the rightful owners, the American Indians? Black Power, and this is I'm saying this because I need you guys to understand their need for a false equivalency, because they do not want to look like the disproportionate attackers. Okay, they want to justify their violence against us and against black people. Okay, so one of the ways they do this is they create false equivalency between the Black Panther Party and the KKK, for instance. They create false equivalencies between the notion of black power and when white people, white supremacists say white power. Okay, it sounds the same, but the meaning is completely different. It says black power means that black men want to have some control over their own lives, to have a respected voice in public affairs that affect them. We resent being a colonial people treated as third-class citizens in our native land. We resent being forbidden to speak for ourselves, even in black belts where we constitute as much as 85% of the population. We resent being deformed by a white man's mold into a degenerate white supremacy society that derides and belittles our African heritage and make us ashamed of our ethnic characteristics. I don't hear anything that he's saying that's incorrect here. Black power is the vehicle by which we hope to reach a stage wherein we can be proud black people without the necessity of an apology for our non-Anglo-Saxon features. The dominant society in racist America is reactionary, imperialist, racist, and decadent, and we wish to disassociate ourselves from it. Now, that part I don't necessarily co-sign. I don't think that you can disassociate yourself from this country, but that's what he said. You know, I wouldn't go that far. I simply think that we need our own black. We need all black everything. We don't need to be as dependent on the dominant society for our survival. Okay, and you look at things that what people in the 60s said, and this is why they were saying stuff like that, because we have become very dependent on the dominant society, and you see the negative outcome of that. And then he says, continuing, black power is a dissident force challenging the racist white power structure that is so heinously exterminating the people of Vietnam and threatening the world with nuclear destruction. We have been victims of white racism for 400 years in the New World. We have been victims of racist barbarism for almost 200 years under the present form of government. Our people are slaughtered like swine on the main streets of racist America. Our churches and homes have been bombed. Our women raped with impunity. Our men have been emasculated. We are hated and murdered for no other reason than being born black, and because we refuse to commend and love our savage oppressors, we are called racist. Let me repeat that last sentence because that's very important. We are hated and murdered for no, and I can even add to that, targeted, for no other reason than being born black, and because we refuse to commend and love our oppressors. And because we refuse to commend and love our oppressors, we are called racist. Because we don't bow down, by that very nature, we are called racist. That's what he's saying. Because we don't say, "Oh, yes, boss, hit, give me another hit. Lick me again, boss. Take what? Shoot me again." Because we don't accept our oppression, we are called. You have groups like under Hoover. You know, they were labeled as being, black racist organizations because they wouldn't accept their oppression. They wouldn't accept unlawful acts by the state. Again, outside of that one sentence, the rest of what he said, I don't really see what's wrong with that. Y'all can find, if you want to read this whole speech and other speeches like it, you can actually find a PDF of the Black Radical Tradition. You just go to Google and type in the Black Radical Tradition PDF, and there's a long list of things that a lot of people just need to read. Okay? So that's that. And because of that, because you have people today who sound very much like that. You have people today who sound very much like Robert F. Williams. You have the Black Guns Matter crew, okay. You have women even like don't think that it was even just Robert F. Williams. Martin Luther King owned guns at one point in time. Fannie Lou Hamer owned guns. Okay, you know, there's a lengthy history of black people owning guns and gun ownership, and that's always and mind you, they don't care about white people owning guns. It's always been us. It's always been the Black Panthers, you know, owning guns. The Black Panthers running up in that federal building, that state building, in the 1960s. Okay, and that being used as a justification for gun control. They've always been worried about us owning guns, not them. They don't care how many white people own guns. Hence, Stephen Paddock. You know, they let the Stephen Paddocks of America stockpile guns, and they don't do shit about it. Okay, and then they go on killing sprees. Now, the predecessor to the FBI was an organization known as the Bureau of Investigation. Okay, and it targeted, because really the FBI was a sort of the FBI came from an earlier organization. That in this earlier organization, this pre-FBI organization, the Bureau of Investigation, this is where Hoover sort of cut his chops and cut his teeth. And Hoover got started, okay, going after Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Okay, this goes to show you the deep history of FBI and previously the organization before FBI, the FBI, basically upholding white supremacy and attacking, historically, they've been attacking black groups since the 30s. So they went after Garvey, they went after, in the UNIA, they went after the NAACP, they went after W.E.B. Du Bois. This was during like the whole Red Scare, right? You had two Red Scares. You had the first Red Scare, which led to a massacre of black people in 1919. Look up the Red Summer of 1919. You had all these lynchings because of the Red Scare, and they said black people were you know, becoming black Bolsheviks, and because of black people you know, following different communist and socialist ideologies, and now we have to lynch them. You know, so you had the first Red Scare in the whole 1919, 1918, 1920 period. Then you had the second Red Scare, and this is when they got a lot of black intellectuals, a lot of black academics, like I said, Du Bois and a bunch of others. And Du Bois left the damn country. Like, Du Bois went to Ghana. Du Bois said, like, fuck America. Like, after he went through all of that, which is kind of funny. And I was listening to Thought Crimes and their discussion about this, Sincere and Prince, and they were talking about how, you know, Du Bois, like, on his deathbed was saying basically, you know, fuck this country. And what's funny is, and I like Du Bois. You know, Du Bois had a lot of good ideas, and Du Bois had a lot of great writings. Y'all need to study Du Bois, okay? And study Garvey too, but study Du Bois as well. But Du Bois, he screwed up because he allowed himself to be used by the NAACP and basically by a lot of his white benefactors against Garvey in the UNIA, and he ganged up on, you know, with Booker T. Washington. You know, they kind of ganged up on Garvey, and Du Bois ended up being thrown under the bus by the NAACP. And then after, you know, helping to destroy Garvey, he kind of realized later on in life that he was played, because they ended up going after him. They ended up calling him a communist. Okay, so it was when all of this was happening in the second Red Scare in the 50s. Okay, that the COINTELPRO program began. It specifically that began in 1956. Okay, and the agenda of COINTELPRO was to disrupt misdirect, discredit, and neutralize targeted organizations. Some of the tactics of COINTELPRO included, and this is a Freudian slip because it's still going on, using informants, agent provocateurs, legal and illegal wiretaps, false correspondence, which I mentioned earlier, and a tactic known as quote-unquote badjacketing, which meant to make a member of a group appear to be a collaborator with the state when in fact they weren't. So they would just basically like plant evidence, and trying to make it seem. And this was done to sow division within groups. They did this to the Black Panthers, where they made it seem like certain Panthers were collaborating with the state, and they might not have been, but the Panthers didn't know that. So it just created a lot of distrust and disunity within the organization. And you have to understand, this was a psychological warfare tactic, also known as psyops. Okay. And one of the other tactics they used was they called the parents of civil rights activists and said that, their child had been kidnapped or murdered. And they used all kinds of like effed up tactics like that. Another psyop tactic that they used was they sent a letter to Martin Luther King and they told King that he should kill himself. They used to call people on the phone when they were at home and not say anything, and you just hear this weird breathing in the on the other line, or it would be like some person on the other line that would say, we're gonna kill you, or you should kill yourself, or they might even play a recording of, supposedly there were recordings played to Coretta Scott King that the FBI alerted Coretta Scott King to about different people that King was cheating on her with. So Coretta Scott King would be in the house and they left recordings on her message service of King having sexual relations with different women. Like, they did all kinds of like dirtbag shit like that. Okay. That's COINTELPRO. And there are articles, there's some good articles, there's some PBS articles about this. I think, what was the other website that I saw? Okay, so yeah, there was a Daily Beast article. So there's a really good Daily Beast article. I think the Jacobin magazine, they had a really good article that I came across. There's good information online, and there are some good books about this as well. People really need to study this history, because this is something that a lot of people don't really know about. And a lot of people don't really know the tactics that are used to destroy the credibility of black organizations. Okay, so COINTELPRO was exposed eventually in 1971 by a group of white leftist activists. They broke into an FBI office outside of Philadelphia, and they stole documents that were eventually leaked to the press, and it exposed the whole 15-year COINTELPRO program. Okay, so, kudos to them. And they're still alive, actually. They came forward a few years ago. And there was even a book written about it. I have to get that book, because the book, if I'm not mistaken, is called The Break-In. I want to read that book. And I'm really about to study up on this history outside of just reading articles online. Like, I'm about to dig in deep to this history, because people need to be aware of the tactics that are going to be used potentially against them. And before I end this, keep this in mind. I'm about to end this video. There are really 5 main fears of blackness. Okay? You have social fears of blackness. This is why you have had anti-miscegenation laws, where they didn't want black men and black women intermingling, anti-interracial marriage laws. They never really cared about white men and black women. It was really preventing black men from being with white women. Okay, so, but not just that, not just anti-miscegenation laws, but social fears of just basic interactions. This is why so many of them were against integration. So you have social fears of blackness, you have historic fears of blackness, you have economic fears of blackness, and they are afraid of black people, wisening up and not doing business with them anymore and doing business with each other. which if you read the works of Claude Anderson, this might have been one of the reasons they eventually gave into integration in the first place, because they wanted to destroy black economic power. Okay, so you can more easily do that when, black businesses can't easily compete with white ones. So you destroy the black economic base, which is why today we need to get back into forming a black economy, a black political economy. But I don't want to go too deeply into that. I don't want to put all of our ideas on the internet. Okay, so they're fearful of political blackness. So they're terrified of black people becoming politically active, which is why I talk so much about voter suppression and voting rights, which is why I do not agree and I do not think it is wise or smart for black people to disassociate from politics. That is a bad move. You are playing directly into their hands when you do that. That's what they want. They do not want black people getting politically active. The mistake that we've made as black people since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, the mistake we've made is buying too much into the Democratic Party. That was a major mistake. So what we've done since the 60s, the problem isn't voting. This goes over people's heads. The problem isn't voting. The problem is who we're voting for and the political party that we're putting so much of our energy into. Okay, so yeah, we can thank the Democratic Party for civil rights legislation. There's nothing wrong with that. But that was a long time ago now. Civil rights was decades ago. And since then, the Democratic Party has done absolutely nothing for black people. As a matter of fact, the Democratic Party has largely walked in lockstep with the Republican Party on criminal justice issues. It's basically been a one-party system when it comes to state violence. It's been a one-party system when it comes to the criminal injustice system. Which is why you can get Democratic mayors like Rahm Emanuel that basically interact with the Chicago population, the local black Chicago population, no differently than a racist white politician. Which is why you get Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton that pass 3 strikes and you're out. The Democrats have a horrible record on criminal justice. Horrendous. They've basically been right-wing Republicans on that issue. So they're afraid of black people becoming politically hip to that and distancing themselves or ourselves from the Democratic Party. And like I said earlier, allying with other parties, third parties, or even forming our own party. And then there's a scientific fear of blackness. So this gets into the whole issues of recessive and dominant and recessive genes. Dr. Francis Cress Wilson has talked about this. You can look into verifiable scientific research on melanin. Okay, they've been fearful of they've been studying us from a scientific perspective for decades. Y'all need to read a book. It's very hard to read, but I actually have it in my library. It's a book called Medical Apartheid. That completely breaks down the history of scientific racism in America. So you have, like I said, 5 fears of blackness: social, historic, economic, political, and scientific. This is why they have historically been terrified of black progressivism. This is why they have been historically terrified of black independence, black independent mindset. They want us dependent on them. They want us on that welfare. They want us dependent on the state. Because a dependent population is a controllable population. A dependent population is a weak population. Once we start getting on the same page economically, once we start getting on the same page politically, once we understand our position historically and that we were great people in Africa, we weren't all kings and queens, no, but some of us were. And even if we weren't, we were blacksmiths. Okay, we were iron workers. We were leather workers. We were farmers. We had millions of acres of land in Africa. So even though we weren't all kings and queens, we had our own shit. We had powerful empires. We had the Mali Empire. We had the Ghana Empire. We had the Songhai Empire, which were Muslim, by the way. A lot of us are, as quietly as it's kept, a lot of black Americans are descendants of black Muslims, the direct descendants of these black Islamic empires. Not all of us, but some of us are. Some of us are descendants of the Ashanti in Nigeria. Some of us are descendants of the Igbo. Some of us are descendants of the Yoruba. Some of us are descendants of people in Sierra Leone, the Mende, the Mande, the Fulani, the Hausa. They're not all Sierra Leone, but Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Ivory Coast. We had our own stuff back then. And all of that has been lost. So once we understand our role historically, what we've had historically, and we get on the same page economically, black people start getting into STEM. We start getting more black people into chemistry, into physics. We need people in those fields. Once we start doing that, that sends shockwaves, and they become very terrified of that. So I'm going to end this video here. Understand that, like I said, this report targets everybody. Anybody and everybody. It's not talking about a specific gender, male and female. Even the non-violent ones. Okay, so people just need to be aware of that. People need to be mindful of that. So stay safe, stay smart, and stay defiant.